Today I want to break down for you one of my favorite beats that I've been working on. It's a pop beat, hip hop beat, doesn't really matter. The reason I want to show it to you is because I'm using one of my all-time favorite tools for music production, which is my voice. Never learned the piano, grew up playing the drums, and coming up with melodies was always hard for me when it came to the keyboard. Been too stubborn to take piano lessons, although I still need to. Every year I'm like, I'm going to do it, but still not there yet. But where I don't struggle is coming up with the melodies in my head. And the way that I let those out is with the microphone. And oftentimes that can help with songwriting, but it also really helps with my production. So I want to show you how you can make a beat really simply using mostly just your voice, letting your voice guide you through the production process. So I recorded myself just doing really, really random noises. I threw a little auto-tune on it, and it sounded really bad, but I was kind of like having trouble coming up with anything when I made this beat. And I was like, you know what? I'm going to make a beat with this. So this is what the vocal sounded like. I mean, it's really random, but that's the kind of challenge that I like. Sometimes coming up with games for myself is when I end up making some of my favorite music. Now, I threw that vocal into this sampler here. It got loaded in classic mode, which is how I just played it for you. But if I switch to slice mode, what happens is it auto-detects all of the slices around the transients that it finds. And I changed the sensitivity a little bit down to 89%, but basically my keyboard started sounding like this. And I ended up really liking these notes in particular. So I recorded something simple with that, and then I edited the MIDI afterwards, and I'll show you what that sounds like. Let's just throw this right here. And it sounds like this. You get the idea. Pretty cool. Definitely sounds like a vocal still though, and I wanted it to sound a little bit more synthy, and that's when the processing started happening. So I'm just going to loop this here and go through the processing of this one by one, and then we're going to go through the rest of the beat. First thing I did was I added this little altar boy. Just brought down the format minus 4.1 and added some drive, and immediately the sound changed. Up next, I added a radiator, an amazing distortion plugin. Then I added this EQ cut where I'm really taking out a lot of the highs and some of the mids. Kind of just smoothed out the synth, a really good starting point. Then I added this guitar rig, which is a pretty complex chain, and it sounded like this. Next, I cut more of the highs and added a little bit more reverb using the RC20, but I brought down the dry wet quite a bit, so it's actually not. Let's take a listen to it in full. But we're going to leave it around here. Now this is sounding really good, but it started sounding a little too muffly because I've cut so many of the highs. But through these surgical EQ cuts, it leaves me room that if I were to boost the highs now, I think it's going to sound smoother in general. And I did that with the C6. Awesome. Up next, a little bit more reverb with this Valhalla Room. Another EQ cut going into those mids. Awesome. Then some compression. This EQ is a pretty drastic cut, kind of a radio EQ. All right. Lastly, I don't know why I did this in a whole new EQ. I could have done that in one of these EQs earlier, but little EQ cut. Then I added this exciter here. Another compressor. Another EQ. More reverb. This one's a longer reverb, but very little of the reverb in the mix. Then I have this neutron that I think I just used the mix assistant for. And lastly, this Ozone 8 imager. I don't know why I used Ozone 8 because I have Ozone 9 and I think I use it later on, but you can see that I'm bringing the mids quite a bit more mono, and I'm adding a little bit more width up top. So that's the chain here. And as you can hear, let me see if I can just group everything together, is before. Really brought that sound to life. I spent probably the bulk of my time just putting that processing together. It took me maybe 30 minutes, then the rest of the beat came together maybe in 10 or 15 more. So sometimes I'll spend all my time on one detail, and once I have that, everything else just comes to me. Let's now move on and let's bring in the next section of this beat. This first part here, as soon as I made it, I knew that it was hooky enough to be the hook. But I thought it was a little bit too much information for the verse or the pre because I wanted this song to be really simple and stripped down so a vocalist can actually use all that information with their words. It doesn't have so much going on in the background. So what I did was I created another MIDI channel, and I basically just put in that same vocal chop line with no processing here. What I did was I clicked this divided by 2, which makes the sound twice as fast, which is really choppy. So now if I play it, and if I multiply it by 2, it'll sound like the original. Divided by 2. Really quick. And I then dragged this MIDI down. And I really just primarily liked those first few notes. So created this MIDI line for this, and I thought this will be way better for a verse. So let's get rid of it. This will be our intro, and here comes our verses. So it sounds like this. But I wanted it to sound a little bit more James Brown, like vocal classic sample. So what I did was I created a similar chain, but a less complex chain for it. In this, I have the same little altar boy, but with less drive, same radiator, same reverb, only one EQ cut, a compressor, another EQ cut. I think it's that same telephone one, and then an imager. But let's take a listen to it now. Yeah, I feel like that's saucy. So really liked that. I'm going to turn this back on so we don't lose it. We'll call this vocal 1 and this vocal 2. Cool. Now bring this down a little bit as well. Once I had this, I realized, okay, so let's do what, a 16-bar verse, maybe an 8-bar pre, and then we're going to go back to the hook. But I realized I needed a couple more elements. So I found this pluck sound, and we'll put this in here. Pretty cheesy. Not great, but was good enough for me to write this synth line to. And I liked that for the intro, but definitely didn't like how it was sounding. So really quickly, I just added Mr. Mango Plucks to it, which is an Ableton device that I have for sale at mrmango.com if you want to grab it. And I used this quick pluck preset, turn down the output a little bit. Yeah, I like how that's sounding way better. And that was pretty much it for the intro. Just decided to add a few other drums to it. So let's do that now. So I'm going to get out of this vocal chops group now, and I'm going to create a few MIDI channels, but I want this to be, in the instrument. There we go. Create a few MIDI channels and an audio channel. And let's group these and call it intro drums. And I'll just group it again and call it drums because we're going to put some drum processing on all the drums later. But the first sound that I think I came up with was this kind of, how do I describe it? It sounds a little bit to me like a horse walking through the stables. To let you take a listen to it. Oh my God, I'm so impatient. That felt like it took forever. But let's hear that in the mix. And I like the fact that it was different every couple snares. Especially you can see on the stereo, there's a lot less going on that second one. But I decided to add a few more sounds to it, starting with this rim shot. So let's record this. I'm having some latency, so I promise you I have better timing than this is probably going to sound. Oh my God, that latency is making me look so weak. Just quantizing them. And let's make sure that the levels are all the same. Cool. And then I'm going to duplicate that out. Now for the second sound, I wanted it to only happen every other snare. So it's going to go like that. And let's just bring this snare sound onto it, bring it down a bit. Cool. And lastly, I'm going to add this vocal hit. And that's going to happen on every fourth snare. So get rid of you, duplicate you, and let's turn that down as well. Well, let's take a listen. Awesome. So now we come to our verse. I was done with the intro at that point. I like to keep really simple intros when I'm still in the writing stage before I hand it off to a vocalist. Once I get that back and we start arranging the song out, that's when I'll do more details. But simple intro like that, I think, goes a long way. When I heard this, what I call James Brownie kind of sample here, what I thought I needed at first was a lot of drums. And then what I ended up landing on was a really simple percussion loop that I put together. So let's just, not in here. Let's create a new drum here, but I'm going to take it out of this intro drums group and just put it into the drums. And I'll call it perk. We can close this intro drums now. And let's put this percussion loop in. Yeah, I love it. Gonna bring those plucks back in, but I have a separate MIDI for them. I changed the MIDI a little bit. It's gonna sound like this. Cool. So gonna duplicate that out for the verse and the pre, as well as the plucks. Didn't want to add any more drums than this, not until the drop. I thought keeping this really bare bones was actually kind of cool. And yeah, I'm going to stick by that. I think it's cool. That's why I did it. Up next, I'm going to add the second element to the verse. So for the first 8 bars of the verse, I just wanted it to be pluck, vocal synth, and this percussion loop. For the second half, I started coming up with melody in my head, and I tried whistling it into the mic. It sounded kind of screwed up, but I liked the screwed upness of it. So let's throw that in here, and you can hear it raw. Too loud. Let's bring it down. And I threw some auto-tune on there because can't whistle and pitch that well. And you can see I have the note transition and speed as quick as they go. That way I'm getting kind of that cool Middle Eastern flute sound with my whistle. And I really like how messed up it sounds, but I wanted to screw it up even more. So I used another effect or device that I have for sale at mrmango.com, which is called Mr. Mango Synth Magic. And if I put that on here, and it gets loaded on this try on whistle preset, which is perfect because it's a whistle. Let's take a listen. Love that. That sounds like a weird cassette type flute. And yeah, we're going to leave it there. Maybe turn it down even a little bit more. So what we have here in the verse is we have just a pretty bare bones first 8 bars, introducing this whistle for the next 8 bars. And then for the pre, what I did was I recorded 3 separate vocal harmonies, and I just threw on a little bit of distortion, I think using the radiator. And I bounced those and I put them together. So we're going to bring those in now. Put those, oops, not there. Let's put these before the drums. So this will be this will be harmony. And it's going to be probably too loud. But again, this is just 3 different harmonies I sang with distortion, and I panned them each out separately. So you're going to hear where they're at. Way too loud. Let's put the processing on. So for these harmonies, did a lot of EQ cutting. Maybe I'll walk through one more time what I did here. So you've heard it in its original form, and now I'm just going to add each step of the processing. First thing I did was add this EQ. So dry. All right, so got rid of some destruction there in the mids. Next, I have this RC20, and what you see here is I think I used the VHS preset to start, and then I just started messing around with it. I have distortion, bit crush, and magnetic, which I think is like the chorus effect. I have the EQ cutting going down here, and then I have most of the dry wet up. So let's add that in. Yeah, that just made it sound much older. And let's bring in this second EQ cut. This one cleaned up a lot of it. All right, one more EQ cut. So what I'm doing here is sometimes I'll have a sound that's too loud, like you heard at the beginning, and I really like the characteristics of it that loud. And if I just turn it down, it doesn't sound how I'm hearing it in my head. And sometimes you can get away with carving the hell out of an EQ, and you're going to actually bring that level down without actually adjusting the level just by bringing it down. You're just changing the characteristics of the sound, the frequencies. So this is the primary processing. Next, I have a reverb where I'm washing this out quite a lot. I have 38% of the wet in this mix. So let's take a listen with the reverb. Off. Just sounds more like it's in a hall. You heard that decay, I think. And then I have this auto filter because I'm going to automate these coming in. I don't want them to just come right in on you. And then lastly, I have this neutron, which I think I used, again, the mix assistant for. Oh, no, I used a piano preset for it. Who knows why? Let's hear it before. Just gave it a little bit more presence. And then this exciter I have. Awesome. So let's turn down the harmony a little bit. I still think it's a little loud there. And then I'm going to automate the frequency of this. Maybe we'll start around 400 hertz, somewhere there, maybe a little higher than that. Yeah. And we'll come all the way up towards the end. So it's going to get introduced as the pre like this. Awesome. Only other sound I did to the verses was I layered a bass behind this so that it sounded like the vocal was bigger than it actually was. I don't have that much bass in my voice, but by adding a little bit of bass, distorted bass below it, it actually, to me, tricks me and makes me think that the bass is coming from the vocals, even though it's not. So let's create another MIDI track. And I'm actually going to put this MIDI track in the drum section so it gets processed with the drums. And let's put in the bass. All right, so I'm not going to go through the processing of this bass because it's actually the same bass I'm using in the drop. And when I go to the drop or the hook, I'll go through the processing a lot more. The only difference between this and that is a little bit different EQ, and I'm going to be filtering it in differently, but it's the same processing. So we'll get to the processing later of this bass. Let me just turn it down a little bit before, and let me bring in the MIDI for it. Let's take a listen. So I'm playing the bass along with different harmonies going on in here. So when they're played together, it sounds like this. But I don't want this bass to come in full, so I'm actually going to be using this high-pass filter to start it maybe at 130 hertz, coming all the way down for the last note. So let's take a listen. Perfect. I think that sounds sick. So now that we have our intro and our verses, let's take a quick listen to it, and then let's work on the drop or the hook. Awesome. So a couple things I did while we were listening to that is I just reintroduced the intro and the hook vocal chop MIDI so that we know that a change is happening. Obviously, this pre already sounds like something's coming, but by reintroducing this, then when that comes back in, it's kind of like, I don't know, treat your listener like they're stupid is kind of how I like to look at it. If you introduce something that they've already heard before, then they go, oh, I know this, and they're more likely to get into it. Since we heard that in the intro, giving them a taste of that coming back before the hook, they're going to already feel like they know what's coming, and that automatically makes people excited. All right, so we have the bare bones of the hook by just having this vocal chop here, and we're going to use this same pluck but all right, we already have the pluck. I'm going to use the same pluck MIDI here for the hook, but I'm going to duplicate this track. Let's get rid of this, and I'm going to delete all the rest here because I want to use slightly different processing on this. I'm going to use the Mr. Mango plucks, but I'm going to probably adjust the length a little bit longer, maybe a little bit more reverb, maybe a little more width. We'll leave it there for now. Who knows? I might come back in and change the processing of that in a sec. But let's work on the drums here. First thing I want to do is put in the kick. So let's just change this loop. 4 bars, that sounds good. And we have the bass there. Let's put in our kick. And I have that right here. Cool. Sounds like this. Just have a little compression on it. Love using this on kicks. And I have a transient on it. Transient shaper, I should say, bringing the sustain down a little bit and the tack up, and that just makes the kick a little bit punchier. Let's turn it off. Let's see if we can tell. Yeah. I heard the difference. And let's put in the MIDI for the kick that I have there. And let's just hear where we're at. Cool. Yeah, let's duplicate that out for the whole hook length. And next, not a MIDI track. Let's bring in just the clap and the snare that I have. So this is called claps because I actually layered 4 different claps. I panned 2 of them out and I changed the leveling on them, but I didn't put any other processing. So pretty much just some dry claps stacked here. And snare here. This first snare looks like it got screwed up a little bit in the bounce. So just gonna move that over there. And at the end here, I just have a snare roll. That's the only change up going on in this. And let's see, is there anything else I want to add to this before we bring in the bass? Negative. Let's bring in the bass. So this was bass 2, even though it's the first bass. I'm calling it bass 2 because bass 1 is always the main bass to me. This was just some afterthought bass. So let's create a new track lane and let's put in bass 1. And this is where I'm going to go over the processing. Let's take a look at this processing that we have for the main bass. Very similar to the bass we had before, but actually a little bit simpler. So what I was looking for a bass sound that sounded kind of halfway between a chunky analog bass synth and an 808. And I think I achieved that. Let's take a listen to it just in its raw form. Way too loud. So first thing, I'm going to just turn that down quite a bit. Nice. And if we want to look at the pitch bends I have going on in there, if I switch this to the MIDI control, you can see that I'm doing a pitch bend down on the first note and a pitch bend up on this. And what inspired me to do this was kind of some of the old electro records from Justice back in the early 2000s, which when I was a kid really inspired me to make music. And this was the first time I made a bass line like that, probably in 10 years. And I was really excited to do so. So check out Phantom Part 2 by Justice if you want to see the inspiration for this bass line. But now that we see the pitch bend there, let me just play it for you with my hand gesturing those pitch bends. Now you obviously get it because my hands did it. But yeah, so there's the serum. First step to the processing, I added this equalizer, rolling off a lot of the highs. Next, I added an exciter. Rolling off even more highs with this auto filter. Bringing in this compressor. And this glue compressor I'm using for sidechain, so we're just going to sidechain that to the kick. Cool. C6, bringing out some of the highs and taming these lows. I lied. Oh no, I saw at the very end this got hit. The pitch bend, the highs worked. I was about to say there was no reason to have these highs up here, but there was reason. I'm smart. Next, we have little EQ dip in the mids. And then we have two saturators going on here. Saturation 1 and saturation 2. EQ cut in the mids again. And then this neutron here, I should get rid of these so I'm not stacking hella plugins open, I think this is the mix assistant once again. And the only thing I adjusted was the dry wet on this exciter. And I think I moved it from tape to retro style. But let's add this neutron in. Add in this soothe melodic bass control, awesome on sub basses. And lastly, the Spectre. Awesome. I use awesome too much, but it is an awesome plugin. I love this. It's saturation EQ, so you can't turn anything down. You can only turn stuff up. But I guess you can turn the output and the input up. But I use two bands here, one at 55 hertz and one at 72 hertz. And I have two different distortion types, solid and warm. And I added these in. Off. On. Off. On. I don't know how much you could hear me turning that on and off there, but it actually goes light years. I mean, I can't hear it much in headphones, but when I have my subwoofers on or in the car, this is the slap material right here. Let's listen to it dry. And let's listen to it wet. Awesome. Now, before I keep going, I just want to add a drum bus to this. Really simple one. We might add a little bit more later, but I just have a compressor here and I have brought down the utility a little bit. Let's bring this percussion loop back in. All right, time for some hats. So gonna group a new device here. Call it hats. Let's do total of 4 hats. So the first hi-hat that I have is a hat loop that I have. Sounds like this. Just gonna bring that out. And then for the next hats, let me bring in, gonna put the 16th note hat MIDI I have for the first and the second hat. And then I have a different MIDI for the third hat, which is a little bit more percussive. You can see I have a little roll there. And I also have different lengths of the hats because I'm going to be putting this in classic mode, which means that I can have shorter or longer hats depending on how long the MIDI note is played. So again, I'm going to just duplicate that out, and let's bring in hat 1, hat 2, and hat 3. Let's take a listen. Cool, let's put on a little bit different of a chain on top of the hats. So I just have a compressor and this EQ here on the hats. And this is a mid-side EQ, and I'm basically cutting the side here and cutting the mids here, and that actually spreads out the dynamics or the stereo of the hats, I think. So let's take a listen to it on and off. This is without the compression. And with. Very subtle, but I think that sounds awesome. So the last thing I want to do to this before we take a listen to the whole beat now is I want to add a little something extra to the drums. I'm just going to put Mr. Mango drums on top of the drum bus here. And I already know this is going to be too loud. Take a listen to how loud it is if I just throw this on, because these drums are already pretty processed, so this is like going overkill. Okay, yeah, that's way too loud. So let's bring down the compression quite a bit and this glue quite a bit. And let's see if we can find the sweet spot. Off. I just want to play with this. Kind of cool. All right, so yeah, I like that for the drums. I think this is sounding great. Last thing that I want to do, oh no, I already did it. I duplicated these plucks already, and I think that sounds great. So let's just take a listen to this now from the top. I'm going to throw a little master on it. Oh, no. One very, very important last thing is I'm going to put in a little vocal sample that says, here we go. So that's going to sound like this. Here we go, but let's put in a little effect on that. Here we go, here we go, here we go. There we go. And saturation, reverb, delay. Cool. All right. Now, the moment we've all been waiting for. A little. Oh my God, I had a master on that whole time. Oops. Okay, I produced this with a master on, but I want to just change the master for how we listen to it. Okay. Perfection. From the top. Awesome. I think it sounds great. I hope this was fun to watch. I have a ton of tutorials that are a little bit more specific, going through different tips, tricks, sound design, ideas, but this was just an overview of my thought process when I'm making music. I broke this down into basically the step-by-step of how my brain worked when developing this. Spent the most time on just that vocal chop at the beginning, and then everything I did in order of how I wrote this when I put this beat together. So I hope that this was interesting to watch. Remember, keep it simple. Simple's not always better, but sometimes it is. I hope to see you back here in the future or at mrmango.com. Have a wonderful day or night, whatever. Peace.